Now, let's get started. I would like to introduce you to Dr. Heather Zwickey, our guest today. So, Dr. Heather Zwickey earned a PhD in immunology and microbiology from the University of Colorado Health Science Center. Her research was focused on infectious diseases and vaccine development. Heather went on to complete a postdoctoral fellowship and teach medical school at Yale University, where she worked on immunotherapy for cancer. Heather was recruited to the National University of Natural Medicine in 2002. In the past 18 years, she launched the HealthGot Research Institute and established the School of Graduate Studies at NUNM. Heather still leads an active research program and teaches at that National University of Natural Medicine. In 2018, Dr. Zwickey brought her immunology expertise to the University of Western States, where she teaches immune imbalances and a course on autoimmune disease. And she receives, of course, rave reviews. So join me in welcoming Dr. Zwickey. Heather, feel free to get started whenever you may be ready.
Thank you so much. And Christina, I see you have a question about volume. I tend to be a pretty loud speaker, but if you can't hear me, please do just let me know and I'll try to talk even louder so y'all can hear me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to talk today about immune herbs. Now, my first experience with immune herbs was actually when I was in the 4th grade. My mom suggested that my brother and I were going to be involved in science fair. And she said that what I needed to do was an aloe experiment. So at the time, I honestly didn't know that all kids didn't do this, but she had me cut both of my hands and put aloe on one hand and not on the other hand and see which one healed first. And of course, the hand that got the aloe healed first. So that was my first experience with medicinal herbs. And I have followed medicinal herbs throughout my conventional training. After I finished my PhD, I actually went to India, Nepal, and Uganda and worked with some traditional healers in those countries and looked at how they were using herbs for HIV and infectious disease. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. Let's see here. Let's get these slides moving. So here's my overview of what I am intending to do today. I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit about mechanism. We'll talk about combinations of herbs, and then we'll talk about some other considerations when we're thinking about herbal medicine. So when we think about mechanism of a drug, we think about an active ingredient, and certainly that's going to be true in herbal medicine as well. However, there's more aspects of herbal medicine that contribute to the mechanism of how the herbs work. The second thing I like to think about is the fact that most herbs are probiotics. Then I also think about the prebiotic potential of the herbs. And then I like to think about nanoparticles. And yes, I'm happy to send these slides to Georgia so that she can share them with you. So first, let's talk about active ingredients. Now, when we talk about plant medicine, plants often have one or more so-called active ingredients, and usually it's many, many more. So think about the average plant is going to have 400 or 500 different ingredients in them, and 40 to 50 of those ingredients will likely be active. I'm going to give you a few examples, but the first example is cannabis, and we think about the active ingredient in cannabis as THC. But we all know that CBDs are also in cannabis, right? With ginseng, the active ingredients are called the ginsenosides. And with ashwagandha, which we could all use a lot more of these days because it's a calming herb, the active ingredients are the withanolides. But let's not discount those other constituents because those other ingredients can have activity of their own. They may be assisting the activity of the active ingredient, in fact. So let's go back to our cannabis example. With cannabis, THC being the active ingredient, we know there are other cannabinoids, CBDs, that are in the cannabis plant. And those cannabinoids and other components are very active. So I've given you some example here of some of the diterpenes and triterpenes that are found in cannabis. First of all, look at the names of them, and you'll see that some of them, like limonene, were not discovered first in cannabis. It was first discovered in citrus. Or myrcene was found in hops, and it's an anti-inflammatory. And if you look at these ingredients, you'll see that many of the things that we contribute to cannabis are actually also a result of some of their other active ingredients. So we know when we study cannabis that if people are taking a broad spectrum product, they're going to have very different effects than if they're taking an individual ingredient. In fact, we call that effect with the broad spectrum the entourage effect. What we see is that compounds act synergistically within a plant. With cannabis, the cannabinoids, the terpenes, and the THC all contribute to the mood effects. The terpenes are biologically active, and they actually increase the absorption of the CBDs. So we see that if you just have one ingredient, you're going to have a completely different result than if you're using a whole plant. And that's how I like to think about pharmaceutical medicine versus natural medicine. And when I'm thinking about pharmaceutical medicine, I'm thinking about a single ingredient like this peak on the left here, which is from a mass spec, where you have a single ingredient and it's giving you a whopping result. Whereas in plant medicine, we've got a whole bunch of little things happening, and the result is different. It's not that it's not as effective, it's just that it's different because we may have 50 to 100 things all giving small tweaks to a system. The cool thing about that is it's two completely different ways to address a problem. And people who aren't getting a good result from a pharmaceutical may actually get a better result from a plant medicine. Now, the next thing that I think about with mechanism with herbal medicines is that they act as probiotics. It turns out that every plant has its own microbiome, and microbiome is our buzzword these days, right? We all talk about the gut microbiome and the skin microbiome and the lung microbiome, and I teach a class on gut microbiome at NUNM. So I just actually taught this morning. What we forget is that plants have their own microbiome, and it turns out that their microbiome is part of their healing effect. There was a really interesting study that was done at University of North Carolina in Greensboro that looked at the microbiome of echinacea. And what's really interesting with this study is that one of the researchers, Nadja Chek, looked at echinacea grown in 16 different locations in North Carolina. And she got different results based on the different locations because of the microbes that were in the microbiome of the plant. So echinacea grown in different locations had different medicinal properties. Now, that becomes very relevant when we start taking supplements, because we got to know where our supplements are coming from, or we don't know what the effect is going to be. The next thing we like to think about when we think about the medicinal properties of plants is their prebiotic potential. So this is actually relatively new data. We only started really thinking about the prebiotic potential of medicinal plants in 2018. Where some research started examining some herbs. So Glycyrrhiza glabra is licorice and Ulmus rubra is cyprium. And researchers showed that you got stimulation of different gut microbes from these two herbs. It was previously thought that the activity of the herb was coming from their active ingredients and their other constituents in the herb. And then they discovered that these guys were making microbes grow. They have prebiotic potential. They're inulins. And so now there is more research coming out on this, and we're finding that a lot of the culinary spices are also prebiotic. So not only are they acting as a prebiotic in the form of inulin, of a digestive fiber, but their flavonoids are also causing the growth of different microbes in the gut. And I want to be really clear about this because I think this is important. When we're talking about manipulating the gut microbiome, we actually can manipulate many different health outcomes simply by changing what the microbes in the gut are doing. You don't necessarily have to change the population of microbes, you have to change their activities. So I like to think of this as, you get everybody on the bus and then you assign who's going to make which metabolite. And as long as all the metabolites are getting made, it doesn't matter whether it's a lactobacillus or a bifidobacterium or a Prevotella or who's making it. We just need the activities to happen. More recently, well, somewhat more recently, we actually discovered this a while ago, but the research is just starting to come out. And that is that plants also have nanoparticles. Now, nanoparticles are just small particles, and we hear about them when we learn about computers, but really these are just very small particles. I was in Korea speaking at a conference, and one of the conference presenters was a gentleman from Japan who was trying to figure out what the anti-cancer activity was of a lacquer tree. So he started breaking down the lacquer tree tincture that was being used for cancer in Japan, and he broke it down into the diterpenes and triterpenes, but he still wasn't small enough. And eventually he discovered that what was happening was there were nanoparticles in this lacquer tree. The cool thing with nanoparticles is they are very reactive to their environment. If you put nanoparticles in one environment, they'll do one thing. And if you put them in a different environment, they do something completely different. Oh my goodness, amazing. That's exactly what we see plant medicine doing. We see that in certain environments, plants will stimulate the immune response, and in other environments, they'll shut it down. Wow, how does that happen? Well, it may be happening because of nanoparticles. So, having talked about mechanism, let's move into some combinations. If we look historically at the ancient medical traditions like Ayurveda and Asian medicine and Unani, what we see is that they never used plants in isolation. They always used combinations of plants. So what happens when you use a combination of plants? Well, we started doing some of this research at NUNM, and what we saw is that you got synergistic effects when you added plants together. And if you looked at that mass spec that we looked at earlier, you saw that some ingredients bound together and you got bigger peaks, and that pulled other ingredients completely out of solution, and some of those peaks just completely disappeared. And so when you're using plants together, you're getting entirely new chemicals that are forming. So it is very relevant that these plants were used together. And if you think that a plant that was used together in a combination of 13 things is somehow going to work individually now that you are using it as a single herb, you're wrong. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So we continued. This is a study that we did at NUNM where we looked at synergistic combinations of plants. Harvard thought this was a really interesting idea, and they started putting together all sorts of different combinations of plants based on what was used historically. And what they realized is that the combinations are innumerable. We can't possibly put all the different combinations together. There's just too much data. But I think it behooves us to go back in history and look at which plants were used together and why. Because our pharmaceutical minds likes to think that we should just go by our echinacea or we should just go by our elderberry, when in reality, we should be looking at combinations that are used together historically. So some of the other considerations that we like to think about with plant medicine is whether the plants were grown in a wildcraft versus a monoculture. So let's think about that for a second. Monoculture is when you plant an entire field of a plant. Wildcraft is when you harvest things from the wilderness. Now, when plants were originally used for medicine, they were typically harvested in a wildcraft scenario. But when large populations of people started using these plants, we started planting them in monoculture. What's interesting is the soil is completely different, whether you're doing monoculture versus wildcrafting. And remember, the plant microbiome is contributing to the health aspect of that plant. So it makes a difference whether the plants are wildcrafted or monoculture. And we have to take that into account in our modern use of plant medicine. When I do research in Tanzania, as one of the places that I take students, and yes, dirt versus soil, very good. And one of the things that we do in Tanzania is we work with an ethnobotanist who follows the traditional healers around, and they look at what other plants grow next to the medicinal plants that the traditional healer is using. They also look at whether a goat poops there or a cow poops there, because all of those things are going to nurture the soil and determine what sorts of active ingredients are in those plants. The next thing we have to think about is pesticides. And pesticides, I'm going to group together with things like heavy metals. In our modern society, we have to make sure that our plant medicine is not contaminated with pesticides. We know that pesticides will kill the microbiome of the plant. That's one of the reasons that they use it, is to kill the microbiome of the insect so that the insect doesn't eat the plant. But in killing the microbiome of the insect and the plant, it also is going to kill our own microbiome if we eat those pesticides. So we need to make sure that our plants are pesticide free. One of the things that we worry about these days is also heavy metals. We worry about that. We're on the West Coast in Portland, and we inherit the heavy metals of China when the big thunderclouds come this way. And so what we're seeing is that there is lead in our soil. Well, certain plants that we like to grow out here, including cannabis, are really good detoxifiers of heavy metals. Not only will they detoxify heavy metals from you, they'll detoxify heavy metals from the soil. So if you're growing a marijuana plant in some place like the West Coast, you can be darn sure that there will be heavy metals in the buds of the plants, and you have to clear them out before you're going to sell them to individuals. So keep in mind that some plants are detoxifiers, and they're detoxifying their soil, and we're not thinking about that when we eat them. The third thing that I like to think about is environment and stress. So my students love to post pictures of their healthy, happy, big, beautiful plants. And those are fantastic plants, but those are not the best plants for plant medicine. Plants make the medicinal properties when they are under stress, because they're making those medicinal components for themselves to survive in a stressful situation. So actually the best plant medicine comes from a plant that is struggling to survive. I know this scientist and botanical expert who has an herb farm out near us. And he says he likes to walk down through his fields and give plants a good kick now and then, just so that they produce a little bit of extra medicinal property. And of course, that's taking it to an extreme, but I just want us to remember that the best medicine doesn't necessarily come from the most beautiful plant. All right, so how does this work during infectious disease? Obviously, these days, we're all thinking about an infectious disease that is problematic. And so for COVID-19 and other upper respiratory infections, we know that plant medicine can be effective. So the first study for SARS-CoV-2 showing that a plant is effective is on Nigella sativa, which is called black cumin, and it has recently been published. And you can Google it, you'll find it. Plus, I've got a couple slides at the end showing you the data. We also know that micronutrients are super important for people with upper respiratory infections. So there's research out showing that people who have low vitamin D levels have poor poorer outcomes. And we also know that people who have low glutathione levels and low selenium levels have lower or worse outcomes. And the reason for the selenium is likely due to the fact that it's an intercalator for mRNA. So our mRNA virus, selenium inserts itself into the RNA, and then the virus can't be transcribed. Glutathione is most likely working as an antioxidant. But we've studied past respiratory infections, so influenza and other viruses. And for influenza and other viruses, we have lots of studies on herbs, both in vitro and animal studies, and pre-post studies, as well as randomized controlled trials. So here's what we know. We start with the micronutrients. You start by making sure that your body has the appropriate vitamin levels, vitamin D, vitamin C, vitamin A. These are the vitamins that are incredibly important to your immune system. That is not to say that vitamin B and vitamin K do not have an effect on the immune system. They do. It's just that these are the big three when we're thinking about antiviral immunity. Once we know that our micronutrients are in good shape, now we take a strategy of what are we going to use the plant for? We can either kill virus directly, we can block the viral lifespan, which ultimately ends up killing the virus, but just a little indirectly. Or we can stimulate antiviral immunity, which again, ultimately kills the virus, but it's doing it through your immune system killing the virus as opposed to the plant killing the virus. So what are some antiviral herbs? How do we kill virus directly? Probably the best known family of antiviral herbs is the mint family. So peppermint, spearmint, lemon balm, self-heal, sage, oregano, all of these are in the mint family of herbs. And all of these have been shown to be effective against RNA viruses, specifically against HIV. There's research out of Africa, and it used to be published on the WHO website, but they removed it because I think they thought too many people were using this instead of drugs. But the mint family is highly effective, and it's so effective that it works even in a tea form, which is the most dilute form of the herb. Tincture, dried herb, essential oils, all are antiviral as well, but you don't actually need a whole lot of mint to kill a virus. Fennel also works as an antiviral directly, and it can work as a tea, an infusion, or a dried herb as well. Now, I also mentioned that herbs can block the lifespan of viruses, and so they can block at multiple steps of the viral life cycle. In the case of elderberry, it disrupts lipid rafts in the cell membrane, so the viruses can't actually get into the cell. And in that way, it's blocking the uptake of virus. This means that elderberry is actually preventative. Calendula blocks reverse transcriptase, which means you can't get from mRNA to DNA so that you don't actually make new viral particles. And hyssop, which is part of the mint family, blocks viral replication. So it blocks the cellular process required for replication. The last bit of our strategy is going to be stimulating the antiviral immunity. And as an immunologist, this is obviously the one I am most passionate about. We can stimulate an antiviral immune response with all sorts of different things. So we can stimulate it with astragalus. This is a picture of astragalus. We can use something like golden seal in the middle here, which resolves the infection and the inflammation. Or we can use something like lemon balm, which I have here on the right, which reduces the cytokine storm. So I think we've all heard that COVID causes a cytokine storm, and the cytokine storm is actually 11 cytokines that are overproduced during a COVID infection. Well, we don't have good pharmaceuticals to reduce a cytokine storm. We actually have a lot of plant medicines that'll reduce the cytokine storm. And lemon balm just happens to be one of them that is both antiviral and reduces the cytokine storm. I actually think it's a fantastic herb for this particular infection. So how are we going to stimulate antiviral immunity? So I mentioned astragalus and elderberry. golden seal's the active ingredient, or the main active ingredient, is berberine, which is also in Oregon grape root. So when you look at golden seal root or Oregon grape root, like if you scrape it, it's orange, and that's the berberine color, and that is very stimulatory of the immune system. Echinacea is one of those herbs that we were talking about that can either stimulate the immune response, or if you're already having a massive immune response, it'll shut it down. So it's an adaptogenic herb which can respond to the environment. Lemon balm is shutting down an inflammatory response. So if you have too much of an inflammatory response, then we shut it down. Oregano stimulates an inflammatory response, but again, oregano is one of those that acts as a prebiotic. So if you have too much of an immune response, oregano will shut it down because of its prebiotic potential. Mushrooms are super interesting because they are very immunostimulatory, but also adaptogenic. But mushrooms have never really been studied in infectious disease. We use mushrooms for an immune response to cancer. What's interesting is the immune response that you want to have to a tumor is the same as the immune response you want to have to a virus. And so mushrooms are another thing that we can use if we're just trying to keep our immune system healthy for fighting an infectious disease. Now, you notice the mushrooms that I've got listed there are not white button mushrooms. They are reishi, maitake, and cordyceps. And I could add a couple more to this list. Shiitake, which you can get in the grocery store, is also one of the mushrooms that is very strong stimulator of the immune response. You do not get the strong immune response to mushrooms if you just saute them in butter. In order to have a good immune response to mushrooms, you have to boil them for a couple of hours in order to release their beta glucans. And once you've got those beta glucans, you drink the water from the mushrooms, because a lot of the medicinal property is going to be released in the water. So you drink that as tea. And some people hate the flavor of mushroom tea, so then don't use mushrooms, use lemon balm. Whereas other people love it. And then you can use the fiber as a prebiotic. All right, now to go through an entire immune response, you have to resolve at the end. And that's one of the things that we are not seeing with people with COVID. We're seeing that they get stuck in an inflammatory response and they're not resolving. What is required for resolving an immune response? Well, you need to make a chemical that's called resolvins. And in order to make resolvins, you have to have omega-3s in your diet. Now, we know, as people interested in nutrition, that the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio should be 1-to-1, but it's currently like 1-to-10 to 1-to-20. It's actually, I think, 1-to-16 the last time I checked. So none of us are getting enough omega-3s unless we're supplementing with omega-3s. And I think that's one of the things that we're really struggling with in the United States and why we're not clearing the infection as well as some other countries are. I see the question, are these herbs safe for all populations? They are safe for pregnant and breastfeeding moms. Where I start to have questions is when I'm thinking about medications people are on. So some of these herbs will detoxify medications. And if you're on a medication, you should talk to a naturopathic physician to find out if there's a medication herb interaction. So we need more sources of omega-3s in our diet. Usually that's going to come from fish oil, but if you're a vegetarian and you don't eat fish oil, you can get omega-3s from flax oil as well. It's just that a lot of people aren't using flax oil as a source of omega-3s. Now, I told you I would finish with that Nigella sativa black cumin study. The cool thing is black cumin is widely available and it costs like $5. So you can actually use this herb and it can be used with other medications. So let's just take a look. We've got two different populations they looked at, people with moderate COVID, or in panel B, people with severe COVID. Then you've got the number of people who were, well, let's just look at the graph here. Death versus hospitalized requiring oxygen low flow oxygen, not oxygen, etc. What you see is that you get more of the lesser symptoms for people who are on Nigella sativa. So left is the control, right is Nigella sativa, left control, right Nigella sativa, left control. And you see it's shortening the length of infection such that people's infection, most of them were gone by day 8, many gone by day 6 if they were taking Nigella sativa. For moderate COVID, if we go down here to severe COVID, again, we see a huge reduction in the number of people. Nobody's dying at day 8, which is nice. And in fact, nobody died at all in the Nigella sativa group. I think this is really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it's a single herb, and as a single herb, it's having a positive effect. Think of the effects we could have if we were using combinations. But I just reviewed a paper out of Asia, where they were talking about how they were all baffled by Western countries, because in all Asian countries, they've been recommending herbal medicine for COVID all along. And in the US and in Europe, not only are we not recommending herbal medicine, we're saying it's unsafe. And they can't understand why. And France actually put out a warning saying that herbal medicine could kill you with COVID. And that's not the data that's coming out of Asia at all. They're actually finding that herbal medicine is very effective for COVID. So the information that we get in a country that has a lot of pharmaceutical companies is very different from information that we get from other countries who are recommending herbal medicine. The herbs can both prevent and or treat COVID. Based on my discussion on pesticides, are you recommending organic foods? I do, but I usually do the environmental working group, clean 15, dirty dozen. My research is with people with Parkinson's, and they are highly sensitive to pesticides. And so I work on getting them off of pesticides. We know that for Parkinson's, pesticides are killing their gut microbiome, and that is what is causing their Parkinson's symptoms. Okay, so to conclude, plants work with more than one mechanism. How and where the plant is grown matters, and most herbs are affecting the immune system. They're either affecting the immune system with their active ingredients, or they're affecting the immune system because they interact with the microbiome as a prebiotic or a probiotic. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer more questions. And yes, I am in a naturopathic community, so I know people who are using herbs and I myself used herbs when I had COVID back in March, and my infection lasted 4 days. But I was using combinations of herbs to treat myself. So very different response than what a lot of people have dealt with COVID. Thank you. Is there enough evidence regarding COVID treatment and herbs? It depends. There's one study, so no. So in terms of, are there enough evidence for any treatment that we have right now for COVID? Probably not. But I think that the evidence will grow. The WHO has commissioned a bunch of monographs on different herbs, and people are starting to do those trials. There's 18 clinical trials right now on vitamin C and COVID. There's about the same number of clinical trials on melatonin for COVID. By the way, the dose they're using in the clinical trials on melatonin for COVID are things like 70 milligrams of melatonin. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I take melatonin, I take 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams. 70? Now, keep in mind that these folks are people who are in the hospital, so they can sleep all day, but melatonin is actually been shown to be protective. How many omegas do I recommend a day? As long as you're not on blood thinners, I recommend 2,000 to 4,000 omegas per day, depending on whether someone has chronic inflammation or not. If no chronic inflammation, then 2,000. If chronic inflammation, then 4,000. Are there good Opportunities to conduct research. I think that would be a question for Georgia, because I do research at NUNM. I don't do research at Western States, and I don't know what the opportunities are there.
I will go ahead and jump in, and I'll let anybody write those final questions. The short answer is that we are not doing active research at our university. It rather is more on the clinical focused side. So while there may be research in the future, if we ever decide to implement a DCN or a doctor, another doctoral program, at this time it is mostly focused on that clinical element.
Yes, I do teach at Western States. I teach the immunology class and the autoimmunity class at Western States. If you Google me, you'll find that I actually teach at lots of institutions because teaching is my passion. So I teach also at National University of Natural Medicine, at Oregon Health and Science University, at University of Washington. I have a lot of faculty appointments.
Wonderful. Any final questions for Heather? I see just a couple more.
Looks like just thank you.
Some thanks. I absolutely agree. What an incredible presentation. I will go ahead and throw my thanks in there as well. Yes, we are about to transition into the admission question, the person that asked if it is now time for admission questions. So start thinking about those. We are going to say goodbye to Heather. Thank you again.
Bye, everyone.
So much.
Good luck with your journey.